To understand what happened, you have to understand the ecosystem it happened inside, not to excuse it, but because a lie like this, one that holds for 17 years, that is believed by the person it was told to, doesn't survive on force. It survives on love and repetition, and a family that had already learned to let one person carry the narrative because that person was very good at it, and the rest of them were tired. My mother's name is Margaret. I'm not going to change that or soften it. She is a specific person, and the specificity matters. Margaret is, and I mean this as description, not accusation, the kind of woman who organized other people's grief for them. Not in a controlling way, in a genuinely capable way. She moved through emergencies with a composure that looked, from the outside, like certainty. You believed she knew what she was doing because she acted like someone who knew what she was doing. And when you are 9 or 12 or 14 and something terrible is happening, you reach for that certainty the way you'd reach for a railing in the dark. You don't ask whether it's bolted to the wall. You just hold on. My father left when I was 9. Daniel was 6. Kara was 12. He didn't leave in a dramatic way. No screaming, no thrown objects, no single night when everything changed. He left the way certain things leave, gradually, and then completely. One day there were 4 of us at dinner, and then, over months, there were still 4 of us, but one chair was often empty. And then it was 3 of us, and Margaret did not fall apart. She reorganized. She made lists. She found the through line. We are a family that survives things. And she repeated it until it became true. Until it was the foundational story, the one all the other stories grew out of. I don't say this to indict her. That year was real. Her capability in it was real. What I understand now, that I didn't then, is that the coping mechanism and the problem lived in the same place. Her ability to decide what the story was, and tell it until it became the story, kept us together when my father left. And then, 5 years later, it was the instrument she used on me. I was 13 when Daniel was diagnosed. I remember the texture of that year more clearly than most. Not the events exactly, but the feel of it. Doing algebra on a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room next to someone else's quiet crying. Learning the vocabulary of aplastic anemia, what a low platelet count looked like in a person's face, what the word transfusion felt like when it stopped being frightening and became routine. Watching Margaret move through hospital corridors, talking to doctors in a calm, organized way, writing everything down in a small green notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She was not certain. I know that now. She was terrified, and she had decided, the way she always decided, the way she couldn't help deciding, that her terror was not permitted to exist in a room where her children could see it. So it didn't. It lived somewhere else, somewhere we didn't have access to. And in its place, there was the composure and the green notebook and the organized questions. The donor screening was explained to me as routine. Part of finding the right match, they test family members. It's standard. Nothing to worry about. Just some blood draws and compatibility tests. Margaret told me this in the car on the way to the hospital, in her warm, matter-of-fact voice, the voice she used for information that wasn't worth worrying about. I did not worry about it. I was 13 and then 14 and operating on the assumption that if something required worry, the person telling me would say so. I remember the hospital corridor the day of the procedure. The particular smell of that building. Not unpleasant. Just specific the way institutional buildings are. My mother's hand on my shoulder. A nurse who was very kind, with a pin on her lanyard I stared at while she was talking. I couldn't tell you what it said, just that it was oval and blue. I remember being told to count backward from 10. I don't remember the procedure. A few hours gone, which I was told afterward was the anesthesia from the density scan. I woke up sore in a way that surprised me. I hadn't thought a scan would do that. But Margaret said sometimes the positioning causes muscle tension, and I believed her. And I went home, and I spent 2 weeks in bed with a tiredness that lived in my bones. That particular word? I understand it differently now. Margaret brought soup and said I was run down. The scan had worn me out. I should rest. I rested. Daniel got better. The story formed around me like concrete, and I stood inside it and felt it set, and I thought it was me. She told it with so much love. I need you to understand that before anything else, not as mitigation, but as fact. She wasn't lying the way you imagine a liar lies. No shifty quality, no place where the story comes apart if you push on it. She told it with the ease of someone who has made a thing true through repetition. She'd said it so many times it had become her reality. The brave daughter, the clear yes, the grace under pressure. And she gave that reality to me and to everyone who heard it. And it worked, because it was warm, and because we all wanted it to be true, and because the alternative was something none of us were ready to look at. She wasn't sorry when she told the story. She was proud. That is a real thing. I have to hold both of those at once. 8 weeks ago, I was filling out an insurance form. I want you to understand how ordinary the beginning was. I was not conducting an investigation. I was not suspicious. I was at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with a form that needed to be filed, and there was a question about prior surgical procedures. And I paused, because I didn't know how to categorize what had happened when I was 14. Was a bone marrow harvest a surgical procedure? I thought so. I thought I should list it. I called the hospital and requested my records. I wasn't braced for anything, just the administrative back and forth, the waiting. Not the thing I found. The records arrived in a standard envelope. Thick, but not alarming. I opened it at the kitchen table. I had a cup of coffee. The window was open because it had been warm that week, and I could hear someone on the street below talking on their phone. I remember that detail precisely because it was the last ordinary moment, the last moment before, and my mind has held it carefully ever since. I went through the file methodically. The intake form, my name, my date of birth, my age at the time, 14, in a box on a standard form. The procedure notes. The anesthesia record. The anesthesia record lists the procedure clearly, in language that does not equivocate. Bilateral posterior iliac crest, bone marrow harvest. Not a density scan, not a diagnostic procedure, not anything that could be confused with a density scan by anyone reading the form. A harvest. Both sides. The specific anatomical sites listed in the clean shorthand of a medical record that was never meant to be read by anyone who didn't already know what it meant. I read the word harvest and then I read it 3 more times. Not because I didn't know what it meant, because I did. Because I needed my eyes to keep confirming it. The way you press on a bruise, not to hurt yourself, but because you can't quite believe the hurt is there until you do. I turned to the consent form. I expected to find my name, or at the very least, something I didn't recognize, some signature given by a 14-year-old in a hospital corridor who hadn't been told what she was signing, some artifact of confused teenage compliance that would be painful to see, but would at least mean someone had acknowledged I was a person in that room. There was no signature. There was my mother's signature. Margaret's name. In her handwriting. I know it the way I know my own face, the particular slant of it, the way she makes her capital M, on the line marked parent or legal guardian. The box beside it marked relationship to patient has the word mother written in her hand. Clear, certain, undisturbed by time. There is a line on that form for the patient's signature. It is blank, not crossed out. Not marked as not applicable or waived, just blank. An empty line with the label patient signature above it and nothing on it. Like nobody thought it mattered enough to fill in. Like the line existed by formality, and the formality hadn't seemed worth honoring. I sat at the table for a long time, long enough that my coffee went cold, long enough that the person on the street finished their call and walked away, long enough for the light to shift from afternoon into something closer to evening. I did not call Margaret. I know that seems like the obvious thing. You find something like this, you call the person who can explain it. You demand an answer. I understand why you'd expect that. But here's what was happening in my body while I sat there. Something was very still. Not numb. Still. The kind of still that comes when you understand, before you can articulate it, that you are about to enter a situation you cannot unenter, and your body is making its calculations. I already knew, somewhere low and certain, in a place older than thinking, that if I called Margaret, she would have a version ready. She always has a version ready. That is who she is. And I needed to know what was real before I let her tell me what to think about it. I needed the ground under my feet to be solid before she started talking, because once she started, I would feel the pull, the warmth, the love that is genuinely in her voice, the narrative gravity of 17 years, and I did not trust myself yet to stay standing. I closed the folder. I went to work the next day. I didn't tell anyone. I went back through the records that night and the night after. Reading the way you read when you're looking for the fact that makes it make sense. The notation, the asterisk, the explanatory line that reframes everything into something you can live with. I have been looking for those facts for 2 months now. I found some. Not the ones I was hoping for. The records contain one detail I keep returning to. Not the intake form, not the anesthesia notes, a small specific line near the beginning of the procedure file, in what appears to be a nurse's notation from the preoperative assessment. It wasn't labeled in a way that caught my eye the first time. I almost missed it. I went back on the third pass, reading more slowly, and I found it. I'm not going to tell you what it says yet. Not to be theatrical. I've thought about how to tell this, and I think you need to understand one more thing about the before world, about what the mythology looked like from the inside, before I show you the thing that collapsed it. Because once I show it to you, you can't go back. And I think the going back matters. What I will tell you is this. The first night I sat with the records, I looked at that blank patient signature line for a long time, and I noticed something in the shape of the form itself. The patient signature line and the parent signature line are not adjacent. They are separated by several lines of text. My mother's signature is on the parent line, full and clear and exactly where it should be. The patient line is at the top of the form. My mother's signature is at the bottom. And I keep thinking, she filled it out from the bottom up. I have no way to prove that. But I know her handwriting, and I know the particular efficiency with which she worked through paperwork. I watched her fill out hundreds of forms during Daniel's illness that practiced quickness of someone who had learned not to let the paperwork slow her down. And I cannot stop seeing it. Her pen moving from the bottom of the form upward, filling in her own information, and then reaching the blank patient line at the top and stopping. Stopping and making a choice. I don't know if that's what happened. I don't know if it matters which direction she filled out the form. But I notice it, and I cannot explain it, and that is where I'll leave you for now. I don't know if that's what happened. I don't know if it matters which direction she filled out the form. But I notice it, and I cannot explain it, and that is where I'll leave you for now. The full clinical file took 3 weeks to arrive. I had requested it through the hospital's records department, not the summary I'd gotten before, but everything. Every note, every intake form, every physician annotation from the day of the procedure. I filled out the request form at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd opened the first envelope. I was careful. I checked the boxes. I wrote my date of birth in the spaces provided. I signed my name on the line where it asked for the patient's signature, and I noticed, doing that, that I was signing my own name on a form requesting documents about a procedure for which I had never been asked to sign anything. I mailed it. I went to work. I didn't tell anyone. That was the beginning of what I now think of as the weeks I was trying to find a way out. I want to be honest about that period, because it's the part that's hardest to explain if you haven't been inside it. There is a version of yourself, a stable version, one that makes sense, and you've been her for a long time. You know her history. You know how she holds together. And then something arrives that doesn't fit, and before you do anything else, you try very hard to make it fit. Not because you're foolish, not because denial is simple, but because the stable version is load-bearing. If she goes, everything she's been holding goes with her. I needed to find a version of events that let her stay. So for 3 weeks, while I waited for the file, I tried. The first thing I tried was bureaucratic error. I'm not proud of how long I stayed there, but I stayed for several days. Consent paperwork is complicated. Hospitals lose things. The patient's signature line could have been on a separate page that didn't get copied into the record. It could have been processed differently for minors in that state, in that year. I didn't know the specific law. I hadn't looked it up. That gap, that small, particular ignorance, was somewhere I lived for a while. I let myself not look. I told myself I was waiting for the full file before drawing any conclusions. That was partly true, partly something else. The second thing I tried was my own memory. I have a gap from that day. A few hours I've always understood as anesthesia, the blankness that comes from sedation. I have the before, the waiting room, the smell of the building, my mother's hand on my shoulder in the corridor, a nurse whose lanyard had an oval blue pin I couldn't read from where I was sitting. And I have the after, soreness, a car, my mother's voice saying something about resting, something about eating when I got home. The middle was gone. I'd never examined that gap closely because I thought I knew what it contained. A bone density scan, some imaging, the routine process of a procedure I had already agreed to. It didn't worry me because I believed it'd been given its contents. I thought I knew what happened inside it. What I started to wonder in those 3 weeks was whether some fragment of the truth had been there all along and I had simply filed it under the wrong label, whether I had known on some level that it was more than a scan and had trusted my mother's framing so completely that the knowledge went somewhere quiet, whether I had experienced, physically, partially, the difference between a scan and a harvest, and then spent 17 years sleeping on top of it. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. The idea that your body had information you were never given access to, that part of you knew, and left no note. I don't know if it's true. I think it might be. The tiredness after, 2 weeks in bed, a bone-deep exhaustion my mother said was just stress. Just being run down. I think something in me knew that wasn't right. Density scans don't put you in bed for 2 weeks. I was 14. I didn't have the vocabulary for it. I had my mother's explanation, and I put the tiredness inside it, and I moved on. But in those 3 weeks, I needed the gap to be an accident of sedation. So that is what I told myself it was. The file arrived on a Tuesday. I found it in my mailbox, brought it upstairs, set it on the counter, and made tea before I opened it. That was deliberate. I stood at the counter and drank most of it, and then I sat down. The file was thick. More forms, more annotations, more records from the surrounding days than the initial summary had included. I went through it slowly, page by page. And then I found the attending physician's intake note. I'm going to read it to you the way I read it then. Not because I need you to feel something specific, but because the language matters. When you paraphrase, you give yourself room to soften things. I don't want to soften it. Patient appears unaware of procedure details. Clarification requested from parent. Parent states patient has been fully informed at home in manner appropriate to child's anxiety level. Proceeding. I read it 4 times. Then I set it down and looked out the window and thought, he saw it. A physician. The physician who was about to perform a bilateral posterior iliac crest bone marrow harvest on a 14-year-old girl, looked at that girl and saw something that made him stop, something that made him turn to the parent and ask. And my mother looked back at him and said, she knows. I told her at home. She's anxious about hospitals, so I explained it in a way that wouldn't frighten her. She knows. And he wrote it down and moved on. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about what I must have looked like, whether I was quiet in a way that seemed wrong, whether I'd asked something that didn't make sense for someone who knew what was happening, whether whatever was on my face, when he looked at it, read as something other than hospital nerves. He asked. That's the part that stays with me. He looked at me, something registered, and he asked. My mother answered. The answer was sufficient, and the procedure went ahead. I don't know what to do with the doctor's role in this. That's a true statement, not a performance of fairness. I've turned it over many times. He was not the architect of what happened. He may have been deceived as cleanly as I was. But he had one moment, documented in his own handwriting, where the question was visible. He accepted the answer and moved on. I'm not sure what I think about that exactly. I'm telling you it's there. In the days after I found that note, I did what I now recognize as the final stage of looking for an exit. I called a woman, I'll call her Kay, one of my closest friends growing up, in and out of our house throughout Daniel's illness, someone who knew our family well. I hadn't spoken to her in about 2 years. I told her I was going through some old family stuff and wanted to ask her something. Kept it casual. I said, do you remember much about when I had those hospital tests that year, when Daniel was sick? She said, without any hesitation, oh, of course. She said I had been so brave. She said my mom had told her I was nervous. Understandably, hospitals were a lot, but that I had decided to go ahead with it. She said Margaret was so proud of me. She said it the way you say something that's been repeated enough to feel like fact. I asked if she remembered me talking about it at the time. She thought for a moment. She remembered me being quiet that year, but it was a hard year for everyone. She said Margaret talked about it more than I did. She'd assumed at the time that was just Margaret being protective, not wanting to make a big thing of it. I said, sure, that makes sense. I thanked her and we talked for a few more minutes and then I said I had to go. I sat on my couch and thought carefully about what Kay had just told me. My mother had been telling people I was brave but nervous, that I had gone ahead despite being frightened, that I had decided. Think about what that requires. If I hadn't been told what was happening, then the narrative of my bravery, the specific bravery of choosing to proceed despite fear, has no content. You cannot be brave about something you don't know is happening. Bravery requires understanding the risk and choosing anyway. My mother had been narrating my courage to friends and family for 17 years. She had been describing my decision. A girl who was scared and chose. That is not the story of a woman who forgot to tell her daughter the truth. If someone had ever asked me at a dinner table whether I remembered being nervous going in, I would have said yes, because I was. I've always been nervous about hospitals, and if my mother nodded at that, yes, she was nervous. But she did it anyway. The story would have absorbed my confirmation, and none of us would have noticed that what I was confirming was the nervousness, not the decision. She had built a story that could absorb the truth of my actual experience, my genuine memory of being anxious that day, and reframe it as evidence of courage rather than evidence of not knowing. That is not an accident. That is architecture. I wanted to be wrong. I want to say that clearly. I was not looking for reasons to believe the worst of my mother. I was looking, actively and with real effort, for the version where she was a frightened woman who moved too fast, made a decision she regretted, told herself she'd explain it later, and later never came. I wanted the intake note to be a formality. I wanted the blank signature line to be an oversight. I wanted Kay's memory to be just the warmth people add to old stories. I couldn't find that version. I looked for it for 3 weeks. In the physician's note, in Kay's account. And I could not locate it. What I found instead was a woman who had thought clearly and chosen deliberately. I put the file back in its envelope and went to bed. In the morning, my hip locked the way it does every morning, the grinding catch before it releases, the slow stand, the wait. And I made coffee and sat at my table and thought about the fact that I had been treating that hip as a congenital problem for 15 years. I had an appointment with my rheumatologist. I'd made it months earlier before any of this, because the hip had been worse than usual that winter and I was tired of being told to do more physical therapy. I had a file now. I thought about bringing it. I decided I would. The appointment was 3 weeks away. I put the file in my bag and left it there. I went to work. I saw friends. I had dinner with Kara, who mentioned Margaret's blood pressure, some minor worry, and I sat across from her and said the things you say and thought about the file in my bag. One afternoon, a colleague, someone I like, someone I work closely with, asked how I was doing. Not the automatic version, the actual version, where she looked at me and waited. She'd noticed it'd been quiet. I said I was fine. Some family stuff, but I was handling it. She said, "You sure?" I said, "Yeah." She nodded and let it go. I sat at my desk afterward and thought about how many times in the past few weeks I'd said some version of that. Fine. Handling it. Some family stuff. The words weren't exactly lies. I was going to work, eating, sleeping, but they were the frame that held everything else in place. As long as I kept using them, the two realities could coexist. The everyday one and the one in the file in my bag. I think I needed that for a while, the last thing I could give myself before the appointment. I walked into my rheumatologist's office on a Thursday afternoon in late winter. I'd been seeing her for about 2 years. She's precise, careful, one of those doctors who actually reads the file before she comes into the room. She came in, said hello, asked about the flare-up. I said it was about the same. Normal beginning. Then I said, "I want to show you something." I took the file out of my bag and set it on the table between us. I said, "I found out recently that I had a procedure at 14 that I wasn't told about at the time. I want to know if it could be related to what we've been looking at." She looked at me for a moment. Then she took the file and read. She read carefully. She asked me to clarify a few things. The year, my age, whether there had been any follow-up care documented afterward. There hadn't been. She asked about the 2 weeks in bed. I told her. She asked when the hip symptoms had started. She had my full history in her system, years of it, and she went quiet and looked at the records again. Then she said, "The pattern of damage I've been documenting in your hips is consistent with bilateral posterior iliac crest harvest complications." She said it slowly and carefully, the way doctors speak when they're handing you something they know is going to change things. She said, "This isn't definitive. I can't say with certainty the harvest caused it, but it's consistent in a way that, had I known earlier, would have changed my treatment approach." I asked about my immune profile. She'd been monitoring irregularities for over a year, patterns she'd described as atypical, not fully explained. She pulled up the notes and looked at them again against what she'd just read. She said, "Immune dysregulation following a major marrow harvest in adolescence, particularly without appropriate follow-up care, is a documented phenomenon. Your profile is consistent with that history." I said, "I had 2 miscarriages." She looked at me. She said, "I can't make that connection definitively." I said, "But you can't rule it out." She said, "No, I can't rule it out." I want to tell you what that sentence sounds like when someone says it in a quiet room with fluorescent lighting and a model of the human spine on the shelf behind them. It sounds like nothing at first. It is so carefully qualified that your brain registers it as a non-statement. "I can't rule it out" is not a confirmation. It is not a diagnosis. It hands you a probability in place of a certainty and asks you to live inside it. I've been living inside it for 6 weeks. I think about 2 pregnancies that didn't hold. I think about what I was told at the time, by doctors managing those situations, none of whom knew what was in my history, because I didn't know what was in my history, because my mother had organized it for me and handed me a version with this left out. I think about what different treatment might have looked like, whether anyone would have looked more carefully. I cannot tell you what would have happened. I'm not going to say my mother's choice cost me those 2 pregnancies, because I can't prove it and I won't make a claim I can't support. But for 17 years, I had a medical history that was incomplete in a way that affected my care, and the incompleteness was not an accident, and I will never fully know what was lost inside that gap. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot and thought about the tiredness after the procedure, the 2 weeks in bed, my mother saying I was run down. I thought about how I had taken that explanation, the way I took every explanation she gave me and put it in the right place, and moved on. She wasn't wrong about everything. I was run down. My body had just been asked to do something significant without being told it was doing it. Of course I was tired. What she left out was that the tiredness had a cause, and the cause had consequences, and the consequences were going to follow me into a body I hadn't yet grown into. By the time I grew into it, I would have spent so many years being told the cause was something else that the word itself, cause, no longer connected to anything. I called my mother that evening, not to confront her. I called because I was in the habit of calling her when things felt hard. I had been doing it for 31 years. I almost didn't notice until she picked up and said my name, warm, ordinary. And I said, "Hi, Mom. I'm tired." And she said, "Get some rest." And I said, "Yeah." We talked about nothing for a while, the small nothing of a Tuesday call. And then I said goodnight and sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after. That is the thing about a long deception. Not that it turns the person into a stranger. It's that you can hang up and sit in the dark feeling simultaneously that you know her better than anyone and that you are only now beginning to understand something about who she is. Those two things don't cancel each other out. I wish they did. They coexist in a way I'm still learning to carry. I need to tell you about my hips. Not for sympathy. But I've spent a long time describing this as an abstract wrong, a consent form, a signature, a blank line, and the body is where the abstract becomes actual. The body is where it lives. I cannot run. I tried at 24, living somewhere with good weather, with a friend who ran half marathons. I trained for 3 weeks. I stretched every morning, bought the right shoes. After 3 weeks, my hip was bad enough that I was waking unable to put weight on it for the first hour of the day, and my doctor at the time told me my hip structure was probably just not compatible with high-impact exercise. I should try swimming. I swam for a while. I stopped. I filed it away. Every morning when I get out of bed, there is a catch. Not dramatic. Not always painful in the way that word suggests. More like a lock. A momentary refusal. My body clearing its throat. I've learned to stand slowly, to wait for it to release. I don't think about it consciously anymore, the way you stop noticing a scar you've had long enough. But I thought about it consciously after that appointment. 17 years of a body doing something it had been changed by, without the information to understand what had changed it. 17 years of doctors given the wrong frame, structural issue, possibly congenital, manageable with physical therapy. Each one working carefully and competently with the history they'd been given, a history with a chapter torn out. I'm working with my rheumatologist now to understand the full picture. That process is ongoing. What I have is a pattern that's been documented by someone who finally has the right context and a treatment approach that looks different from everything that came before it. I'm not going to get fully better. There are 17 years of adapted movement in this body, 17 years of compensation, and some of what was changed cannot be changed back. That is permanent. It lives in me the way the harvest itself lived in me, quietly, without announcing itself, part of the structure of ordinary days. I've been sitting with the question of whether to tell Daniel. Since the first envelope arrived. He is my brother. He is 34 years old. He has 3 children. He has a life that is genuinely good. I mean that literally, not as a rhetorical setup. I love him and I love his children, and I have been standing in the middle of a truth that is also his, in some way, and I have not been able to figure out where the truth ends and the damage begins. I know he didn't know. Daniel was 10 when this happened, a sick child with a family making decisions around him, for him, the way families do. He did not ask for this. He has spent 17 years receiving it the same way I have, as a story about his sister's bravery, a piece of his own history he had no reason to doubt. What I keep coming back to is what telling him costs him, not what it costs me. I've been working through that for 2 months. I mean, what it costs a man who got his life because of something that happened to his sister's body, who has been carrying that as a gift freely given, and who is about to learn that the freedom was not his to receive because it was never offered. I don't know what to do with that. I'm still figuring it out. What I know is, I'm not going to let the decision be made by default. I'm not going to let silence protect the story again. I am not 14 in a hospital corridor, being handed a version of events someone else selected for me. Whatever I decide about Daniel, I am going to decide it. That part is mine. The rheumatologist appointment was 6 weeks ago. Since then, I've had my hip imaging reviewed, started a new treatment protocol, and read the physician's intake note approximately 40 times. Not because I think you'll find something new in it, because some part of me is still verifying that it says what it says. It says what it says. Patient appears unaware of procedure details. That is, a 14-year-old girl in a hospital corridor with an oval blue pin she cannot read on a nurse's lanyard, her mother's hand on her shoulder, waiting for a bone density check. That is me. I have one more piece to tell you. It hasn't happened yet. The next thing I need to do hasn't happened at the time I'm filming this. I have not yet sat across from my mother with everything I know laid out between us. I've been building toward it. I am almost ready. I want to tell you why almost, and not yet. It is not because I'm afraid of her. I've been afraid of many things in the last 2 months, but her response is not one of them. I know her. I've known her for 31 years. I know what composure looks like on her face and what it is managing underneath. I know she will have a version of this. She always has a version, and it will be emotionally coherent and it will prioritize her own understanding of what a mother is required to do. I know all of this. It doesn't frighten me. What I need before I walk into that room is to be sure I'm not going in looking for something she cannot give me. For a while, I wanted her to say something that reordered what I know. Not exactly an apology. I've thought carefully about whether that's what I want, and I don't think it is. What I wanted was a version of events where she hadn't understood the full extent of what she was doing. Where she had believed, in some compressed moment of crisis, that she was doing something small and correctable, and that she would explain it properly afterward, and that, afterward, never came. The intake note closed that door. Kaya's account closed it further. What I know now is not compatible with an innocent explanation. A woman looked at a physician who had noticed something and said, "She knows. She is anxious. She knows." And then she went home and told the story of the brave girl who chose. So I'm not going in looking for the version that makes it smaller. I'm going in with what I have. I'm going to tell you what happens when I do. But first, there is something I noticed in the rheumatologist's notes. A small thing. She referenced the bilateral nature of the harvest and included a summary of the clinical literature on long-term complications. Routine. But one of the studies she cited is from a hospital 3 states over. And the lead researcher on that study has the same last name as the physician who performed my procedure. It may be nothing. Common name. Coincidence. But I noticed it, and I wrote it down, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. This is me saying it. I've been sitting with those 5 words for about a week now, trying to figure out what comes after them. Whether anything does. I thought saying it plainly, out loud, to however many people were going to watch. I thought that was the end of a particular kind of silence. And it was. But silence ending doesn't mean everything resolves. It means you're standing in the room with the noise. So I want to keep going. There are things I didn't say in that last part, not because I was protecting anyone, but because I hadn't finished thinking them through. I think you deserve the fuller version. I think she does too, the 14-year-old. I think she's owed the fullest account of what actually happened, even if she can't hear it. Here's what I kept coming back to in the weeks after I filed that last part. I had the consent form. I had the intake note. I had my rheumatologist's careful, liability-conscious language about what she could and could not rule out. I had Kay's account of my mother narrating the brave girl story across 17 years of dinner parties and family check-ins. I had my mother's own words, "You would have said no, and then what?" sitting at the exact center of my understanding of what she did. I thought I had the shape of the thing. What I didn't have yet was the width of it. There's a detail I haven't mentioned because I wanted to sit with it longer before I said it out loud. It's in the clinical file, not the initial records, but the full file, the ones that took 3 weeks to arrive. Near the back, there are copies of 2 studies cited in the follow-up care notes from the year after the procedure. I don't have a medical background. I read through them slowly, dictionary open on my laptop. One is a research paper on long-term outcomes in pediatric bone marrow donors. Published the year before my procedure, it addresses bilateral harvest complications in adolescent patients, specifically the posterior iliac crest sites. Specifically, the structural changes my rheumatologist has been documenting for 2 years. The lead researcher's last name is the same as the attending physician who performed my procedure. I don't know if they're related. I wrote it down when I noticed it, and I've looked at what I wrote at least 30 times since. I haven't made calls or submitted requests. I've just been holding the fact of it, the coincidence, or the not coincidence, and turning it over. The reason I'm mentioning it now, before I have anything concrete, is that I kept waiting until I did. I wanted to bring it to you as a fact rather than a question. But I've been living in questions for 2 months, and I think you should know which ones are still open. That one is still open. I wrote it down because it felt like the kind of thing that means something. I haven't been wrong about that feeling yet. What I want to talk about today is not the records, not the letter, not the rheumatologist, not Margaret's face when I put the consent form in front of her. I want to talk about how wide the lie was. Not deep. I knew it was deep. I had measured its depth in medical documents and in years, and in the specific quality of pain I feel every morning when I stand up from bed. But I hadn't understood, until a few weeks ago, how many surfaces it had covered. About a month after I confronted Margaret, she called to ask how I was doing. That's how she framed it. Hospitable, careful, the same voice she uses when she's managing something. I told her I was fine. We talked for 11 minutes. She asked about my hip. She asked about work. She mentioned she'd been having headaches. A week later, she had the minor stroke. I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you this for narrative effect. She's recovering. It was minor. She is, by all accounts, going to be all right. I'm telling you because what happened next is part of the story. Kara called. Margaret needed help at the house, papers, sorting, general management of affairs. Kara had taken the week off work and asked if I could come down for a day or two. I said yes. I didn't hesitate. And I want to be honest about why. Not because I'd forgiven everything. Not because the confrontation had softened me into something uncomplicated. She's my mother, and she was in a hospital bed, and Kara needed me. And whatever else is true, those things were also true. So I drove down. I slept in my old room, which still has the same curtain fabric. That particular dusty yellow I've been looking at my whole life. Kara and I sorted through the house over 2 days. She's organized and practical. Always the one who made the lists and checked them off while I stood there deciding if the list was the right list. We worked well together, the way we always have. I want to tell you something about Kara. She was 12 when all of this happened. 12 when Daniel was diagnosed. 12 when the family reorganized itself around his survival. She was in the room, not the hospital room, not the procedure room, but the general room of that year. That family, that particular arrangement of people. She lived inside the same story I did. She hasn't mentioned it. Not once in the 2 months since I found the records. Not during those 2 days at the house. She talked about Margaret's blood pressure medication, the physical therapy schedule, which bills were set to autopay. She made tea the same way Margaret makes tea. Same pot, same order. And we sat at the kitchen table, and she didn't say anything about any of it. I don't know what Kara knows. She was 12. She was there. She has a version of that year somewhere inside her. And I don't know if it's the same version I had, the brave girl who chose story, or whether she's always known something different and made the same calculation Margaret made. That some things are done for the family, not for the person. I don't know. I haven't asked her. I've been standing next to that not knowing, trying to decide what to do with it. What I do know is this. When I was in Margaret's filing cabinet, second drawer, in the manila folder labeled Family, MISC, there was an envelope with my name on it. Margaret's handwriting. I recognized it the way you recognize something you've been looking at since before you knew you were looking. I put it in my bag without saying anything. Kara was in the other room. I didn't open it at the house. I couldn't do it there, in that kitchen, with Kara 3 rooms away and Margaret's reading glasses still sitting on the counter where she'd left them. I got in my car, sat in the driveway for a while. Then I opened it. 4 paragraphs. Both sides of a single sheet of paper. Dated the week before the procedure. She had written it to me. Not to herself. Not in a journal. To me. My name at the top. The first paragraph explains Daniel's diagnosis the way she always explained difficult things to us. No extra softness, no overprotection, just facts in order. She'd obviously written it after processing it herself, after the raw edges had smoothed down enough for her to be organized. She explained the aplastic anemia, the bone marrow failure, the match probability, the procedure. She wrote, "You are a match. The doctors say the probability of a successful outcome is very good. The procedure is routine. You will recover within 2 weeks." The second paragraph explains why she isn't telling me in person. She writes that she's thought about this for a long time and believes the weight of the decision is too much for a 14-year-old to carry, that she doesn't want me to spend the days before the procedure afraid, that she wants me to be able to look back on this as something that happened and was over and was worth it, rather than a choice I had to make under conditions no child should have to navigate. She uses the word protect twice. The third paragraph is the one I've read so many times I have it memorized. She writes, I know that you would want to help your brother if you could. I know you love him. This is me making sure that love is given a shape it can survive inside. Some choices, made freely, would break a person under the weight of having made them. This is not a choice I am taking from you. This is a choice I am holding on your behalf until you are old enough not to need it. The fourth paragraph is shorter. You are braver than you know. You are going to be all right. When you come home, everything will be the same as it was. And then, the last line, the one I've now read aloud 3 times across these videos, the one that sits in my chest like something I can't digest. When you're a mother, you'll understand that some things are done for the family, not for the person. She sealed it, put it in a folder, filed it under family misc. And she waited 17 years for me to become someone who understood. I want to be precise about what that letter is, because it's easy to read it wrong. It isn't a confession. She didn't write it and hide it because she felt guilty. She wrote it because she'd made her decision, and she wanted somewhere to have said so, to have told me, even if telling me was a private act she performed for her own conscience and then sealed in a drawer. The letter wasn't for me. It was written to me, but it was for her. It was the thing she did so she could tell herself she'd been honest, that she'd explained it, even while ensuring I would never read it. The explanation existed. That was what mattered. Whether I received it was secondary. I've thought about what kind of person does that. Not with contempt, as a genuine question I've been sitting inside. She's not someone who moved through the world hurting people because she enjoyed it. She is someone who believed, completely and without apparent doubt, that her understanding of what was best was more reliable than mine. That her love, expressed through control of information and outcome, was a higher form of love than the kind that risks refusal. The intake note says the physician flagged the concern. Patient appears unaware of procedure details. He noticed. He asked my mother. She told him I'd been informed, just gently, in a way suited to my anxiety. He wrote it down and moved on. What I've been thinking about since I found the letter is what she actually said to that doctor. Not just the fact of it, I've known the fact of it for weeks. The texture of it. She was sitting in a hospital corridor with a 10-year-old son who might die, and a doctor who had just expressed concern about her 14-year-old daughter, and she looked at him and said, I've handled it. With full confidence. No hesitation. Because in her understanding of the situation, she had handled it. She'd written the letter. She'd addressed it to me. The explanation existed. That it was sealed in her filing cabinet was a logistical detail she did not consider ethically relevant. I've sat with that for a very long time. Here is what the lie actually cost me. Not symbolically. In fact, I spent 15 years in and out of orthopedic offices being told that my hip was a structural issue, possibly congenital, possibly related to posture, probably manageable, definitely not connected to the procedure I described, because the procedure I described, a bone density scan, wouldn't produce this kind of damage. And I believed it. I did the physical therapy, tried the anti-inflammatories, ran for 3 weeks at 24 before the pain made it impossible, and stopped. I told myself some people can't run, and that was okay. I cannot run. I will probably not run. That's a permanent physical fact produced by a procedure performed on my body without my knowledge, then maintained for 17 years by a wrong diagnosis that was itself produced by my not knowing what the procedure was. That is what was done to my body. My rheumatologist, when she revised my treatment approach, said something I keep turning over. She said, if I'd known the harvest history 2 years ago, I would have started you here instead of there. We lost time. She said it clinically, the way she says most things, and I appreciated that. She wasn't performing regret on my behalf. She was being precise about what the incomplete information had cost in treatment terms. We lost time. 15 years of it because the history that would have clarified the picture was a history I didn't have. And the other thing, I had 2 miscarriages. I'm not going to give you dates or details. Those are mine to hold privately. But I need to say this as plainly as I've said everything else. My rheumatologist looked at my immune profile and told me the pattern is consistent with immune dysregulation following a major adolescent marrow harvest without proper post-operative follow-up. She told me she couldn't rule out a connection to the miscarriages. She said, "I can't rule it out. I cannot tell you that my mother's decision is why I don't have children. I don't know that. My rheumatologist doesn't know that. What I know is that I can't rule it out is a sentence I've been living inside for 6 weeks, and it is a heavy sentence to live inside." My mother's letter says, "When you're a mother, you'll understand." She never imagined I might have tried. She filed her justification in a folder and assumed that time would do the work, that I would arrive at motherhood eventually, and from there I would look back and nod. And the understanding would close over everything like water over a stone. She did not imagine she might have had anything to do with whether I got there. I'm not saying she does. I'm saying she never thought to ask. I called Daniel. I want to say this carefully. That call was the hardest single thing I did in the entire 2 months. Harder than reading the intake note. Harder than putting the consent form on Margaret's kitchen table. Harder than opening the letter in the driveway. Not because I was afraid of him. The opposite. Because I love him. And I knew what I was about to tell him was going to cost him something. And I was going to be the one making that cost. He was going to have to live, from that phone call forward, with a different understanding of his own survival. He was going to know that what his body has been carrying for 21 years, the specific gift of it, the story of it, the weight of gratitude he's held since he was 10, was built on something that was not what he was told. He answered on the second ring. He asked about my hip, because my hip had been worse that week, and he knows the signs. I nearly stopped there. I almost said it's fine and let the call be what he thought it was. I told him. I started with the consent form. Told him there was no signature on it that was mine. Told him about the intake note. I read him the line. Patient appears unaware of procedure details. I told him what my rheumatologist confirmed about the damage pattern, the hip, the treatment years, the time we lost. I didn't read him the letter. That's a decision I made, and am still deciding whether it was the right one. The medical facts were what I needed him to have. The letter I'm holding until I know what giving it to him would mean. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I would have," and stopped. He couldn't finish it. I didn't need him to. He was 10 years old. He didn't have a choice either. He was the reason for the procedure, and nobody asked him if he wanted to be the reason in that particular way. I said, "I know." We didn't talk for a while, just the phone line between us, that specific quality of silence you only have with someone you've known your whole life. Then he said, "Are you going to be okay?" I said, "I'm working on it." He said, "Tell me what you need." I said, "I needed you to know." He said, "Okay." That was the whole thing. And I want to say this, because I don't want to understate it. That 40-minute conversation on a Tuesday afternoon was the only moment in the entire 2 months where I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Not because he fixed anything. He couldn't. But because he sat with it. He didn't try to explain it away, didn't say anything about what it must have been like for Margaret, what she must have been going through, how hard it must have been to make that decision. He just let it be what it was. His relationship with me is the most solid thing I have right now. I've been thinking about Kara. She was in the other room when I found the letter. She has Margaret's composure, Margaret's capacity for organizing other people's grief, and she has never once in 2 months said anything to me about the records or the procedure or the consent form, even though she must know something. She was 12. She was in that house. She's always been more perceptive than she lets on. I don't know what Kara knows. I don't know if she's been sitting across from her own version of the filing cabinet for years, waiting, deciding. I haven't asked her yet. I'm going to have to decide whether to. The last thing I want to leave you with today: the physician who performed my procedure has a last name that is the same as the lead researcher on the pediatric donor outcomes study cited in my follow-up care notes, published the year before my procedure. It addresses bilateral harvest complications in adolescent patients, specifically the posterior iliac crest sites, specifically the structural changes I've been managing since I was 14. I don't know if they're related. I don't know what it means if they are. I wrote it down. I've looked at what I wrote many times. I haven't made calls or submitted requests. I've just been sitting with it. I don't believe in clean coincidences anymore. I'm not sure I ever did, but I'm less sure now than I was. I'm going to find out what it means. She was just a kid who trusted the person who was supposed to tell her the truth. I've been sitting with that sentence for a while. I said it, and then I sat in the quiet of this room, and I thought about whether there was anything left to say after it. There is. Not much. But there is. So here's the rest of it. The first thing I want to tell you about is a phone call. I had been putting it off for 53 days. From the morning I opened the envelope at my kitchen table to the evening I finally called Daniel. I tend to be precise about time now. Imprecision is how 17 years happened. I want to be clear about why I waited. It wasn't that I was afraid of him. Daniel and I have not been afraid of each other since our 20s, when we had the kind of honest conversation that rearranges a relationship into something sturdier. He is 31, same as me, 10 months apart, which is a whole other story about our parents, though a less consequential one. He is the person in my family I trust most completely. He has 3 children. He coaches youth soccer on Sundays. When you are in pain, he does not try to argue you out of it. He just stays. I waited because I loved him. I need you to understand that specifically. For 53 days, I woke up carrying all of this, knowing that the moment I told Daniel, it would become true for him too. He was still living inside a clean version of things. His sister had saved him. He'd been a sick kid. His family had pulled together, and he had survived. He had built part of himself on that, and I was about to take a piece of it away, and I could not give it back. That is what I was afraid of. Not his reaction, his grief. I called on a Thursday evening. He answered on the second ring, which is how he always answers, like he'd been waiting. He asked about my hip. He always asks about my hip. For years, I'd been telling him it was fine, or manageable, or one of those things I was working on. That night, I said it was about the same, which was true, though it was about to mean something different. I said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through it before you respond. He said, okay. I started with the consent form. There was a line for my signature. It was blank. I had been told I was going in for a bone density check. I heard him breathe. I kept going. I gave him the intake note. I read the exact language, because exact language is the thing that makes it impossible to explain away. Patient appears unaware of procedure details. Clarification requested from parent. Parent states, patient has been fully informed at home in manner appropriate to child's anxiety level. Proceeding. I told him about the rheumatologist, the damage pattern, the bilateral harvest complications I'd been living with for 17 years as an unexplained structural issue, the revised treatment plan, the years of wrong management, the physical therapists who had been working on the wrong premise for a decade and a half. I did not read him the letter. I made that decision before I called. The letter was addressed to me. It was mine. The medical facts were what he needed, and what I could give. But the letter felt like something private between my mother and me, written for me, sealed from me, kept about me. That felt different from the clinical record. I wasn't ready to put it in someone else's hands yet. When I finished, Daniel was quiet. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know what to say. The quiet of someone holding something heavy, making sure they have a grip before they move. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I would've." And then he stopped. He didn't finish it. I didn't ask him to. I knew what was in it. He would have said no. He would have refused the match. Gone looking for another donor. However long that took. Whatever it cost. He was 10 years old, and he would have said no. I believe that completely, I said. I know. We stayed on the phone without talking. I was in my kitchen. I don't know where he was. I could hear one of his kids somewhere in the background, a door closing, and then the house going quiet. He said, "Are you going to be okay?" I said, "I'm working on it." He said, "I'm here. Whatever you need. Tell me what helps." I said, "This helped." And it did. Not because he fixed anything. There is nothing to fix. The damage is in my hips, and it is permanent, and the years of wrong treatment are spent, and they don't come back. But he didn't try to smooth it over. He didn't say things happen for a reason, or she was under so much pressure, or maybe she didn't fully understand. He said, "I didn't know." And he sat in the weight of it. That is the only thing anyone can do with something like this. He did it without flinching. In the entire 2 months, it was the only conversation that felt like solid ground. The second decision took longer, and it was colder. And I want to tell it plainly, because I think there's a version of this story where I'm expected to have pursued every avenue. And I didn't. And I need to explain why without either performing regret or performing strength. I consulted with a medical attorney. I wouldn't say more than that about the specifics, because I've chosen to protect details that would identify others. What I'll tell you is what I learned and what I decided. The statute of limitations on the consent violation has passed. I was a minor. The harm was done when I was 14. In my state, that window closed years ago, and there is no exception that applies cleanly to my situation. My attorney was honest about that, and I appreciated her honesty more than I would have appreciated false hope. The physical damage, the hip, the immune dysregulation, the miscarriages, could theoretically ground a civil claim, but theoretically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Proving causation to the standard required would mean years of depositions, experts fighting experts, a process designed to exhaust the claimant. And at the end of it, if I succeeded, I would have a settlement with a confidentiality agreement. And my mother would have spent those years with an attorney whose job was to take everything I have told you and make it look like grief instead of evidence. I thought about being on a stand and being asked why I waited so long to come forward. I thought about how that question lands on a woman's body. I thought about the years of my life between now and any possible resolution. I thought about what it would mean to define the next chapter of my life by a legal process centered on the worst thing that has been done to me. I decided not to pursue it. I want to be precise about what that decision is and isn't. It is not forgiveness. It is not acceptance. It is not the closure people expect when they hear someone has declined to sue. It is a calculation about my own life, where I want to put my time and my body and my attention. I am 31 years old. My hips hurt every morning. I have 2 miscarriages I carry quietly. I have a revised treatment plan and a rheumatologist I now trust. I have Daniel and his kids, and the conversation I made myself have on a Thursday evening. I have this. That is enough to work with. Work with. Those are the right words.